Believe it or not, this is the third attempt of doing this video. I don't know whether or not this stretch of the marathon is cursed, but I keep having issues. Some of them are software issues, some of them are hardware issues, and then actually the most recent one was a me issue. After recording a video all about Genesis of the Daleks, transferring it from camera to laptop, I deleted it. I mean, like, I didn't mean to. I mean, I suppose I could have always, skipped over it. It's not like Genesis of the Daleks is an important story or anything. Hello, welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through Doctor Who from the very beginning, and you join me at the story which used to consistently top every single best ever Doctor Who story poll. So, did it deserve it? Click. That's the sound of something falling into place. Now, when several things all fall into place at the same time, that sound is all the more noticeable, and it's probably why Genesis of the Daleks is almost like a cacophony. The leading man, the producer, and the script editor all seem to realise what it is they've got their hands on, and more crucially, what it is they can do with it. Now, if you throw in the additional click of Terry Nation realising that something new can be done with the Daleks, and the click of a major new player in the Doctor Who Rogues Gallery, and it's no wonder that I can hear all of those clicks as loudly as I can. It's the sound of Genesis of the Daleks as its turn arrives on a marathon. Already not an of the Daleks you'd expect from Terry Nation, and certainly not when you consider his two more recent contributions to Doctor Who, the possibilities and depth of character of the script become a godsend to the team currently in charge of the show. Feeling their way as they first took charge resulted in some careful treading, but a wonderfully interesting viewing experience, if not a truly marvellous finished product. Here, though, they take the best script the show's had in ages, and rather than rely solely on that and approach it the way they feel like the show would have done in the past, they now feel emboldened to do it their own way. It works wonders. And it isn't just the sound of Genesis of the Daleks, not really. It's the sound of the whole show and the people stewarding it from behind the scenes snapping into focus. This is what it can be. This almost laconic confidence gives it a kind of almost a sense of nonchalance, and that casual swagger is entirely earned. And in fact, one of the reasons why I love Genesis of the Daleks so much, and spoiler alert, I do love Genesis of the Daleks, is because it sort of kind of just gets on with itself without making that much of a fuss. It has every right to. It could easily make a big fuss of itself, but it kind of just doesn't. It tells its story, gets on with it, business as usual, but it just happens to be utterly brilliant while it's doing it. It basically doesn't have that energy of look at me, look at me, look at what I can do, but that is what the viewer thinks when they're watching it. I am looking, and blimey, I had no idea you could do this. And as fascinating as the viewing experience has been watching this new iteration of the show realise itself, it has come with a kind of hangover from season 11 and a bit of a disappointing start with Robot. And I have to say that I've had more enjoyment watching the new regime sort of like feeling their way than I have from the stories themselves. And so Genesis of the Daleks comes along and it sort of like washes over me almost luxuriously. I suspected as much, but now I know for sure that the show is in safe hands. Its quality right from the very beginning, the starkly violent opening feeling almost like a statement of intent. Not explicit, not overly gruesome, but undeniably unapologetic. We're not shying away from this side of things. That seems to be the message, loud and clear, and it doesn't. Like, much is made of violence going too far, and certainly that's a debate that's been had about Doctor Who for a really long time. And I guess, like, so I'm not a prude at all by any means, and I do think violence has a very big part to play in storytelling. And I think it's not necessarily that violence goes too far, it's that you have to be really careful that violence still maintains its impact. So, for example, explicit and gratuitous violence can sometimes, like Tarantino uses it as a punchline, for example. Now, I think those films are fantastic and they're good punchlines, and so they still raise the laugh. But if you're using violence in a show like Doctor Who, it's not necessarily meant to be there for laughs. You want the impact of the violence to be something else. And I guess almost cartoonish violence dulls that impact. And Doctor Who needs the violence to have the impact. And so I don't think violence has ever gone too far in Doctor Who necessarily. I think sometimes maybe it went a little bit further than it meant to in scaring children, but that always is a danger. So violence has always been a part of Doctor Who's makeup. But I think with Genesis of the Daleks, it sort of sees Doctor Who approaching a new facet of violence, different from how the show was done before, which only gives this story its own identity all the more, and even a little bit will kind of shape the show going forward. And that new facet of the violence, I think, is a more real depiction of villainy. We've had some excellent adversaries over the years, for sure. In Genesis of the Daleks, though, we're presented with the sadism of the underlings. Previously, the Vaughans and the Chens and the Toxels and the Taganas have dished out prize villainy, but that moment when the guard is toying with dropping Sarah from the top of the rocket, well, I'm not sure we've taken the time to pause over something like that, and it's horrific in part because of that. We don't see that guard before or since. He only exists in that moment, and that moment is to sadistically toy with Sarah. Therefore, the character exists purely for that. And like I say, it's not necessarily that sort of thing hasn't been in Doctor Who before. We've seen villains toy with our heroes, but this is like a one-shot underling. Now, if somebody that low down has those impulses, what's it like at the top? And the Doctor Who universe feels grittier as a result, and it seemed to be entirely necessary for the story that Terry Nation seems to want to be telling with this. Now, recently, and I say recently, look, I'm talking about the marathon in the present tense. I know that he's been dead for over 30 years. When I say recently, I'm really talking about, Planet of the Daleks and Death of the Daleks. And in those two stories, I think he turned in scripts that were functional. They functioned, but they didn't soar. And it's almost a little bit like he'd been forgetting what it was that made the Daleks a creation which resonated as much as they did. But with this story, it feels like, oh boy, is he remembered. The Daleks, of course, were the Nazis, and that is a really potent parallel, and it's why they were able to catch on as much as they did. But what happened was, as I guess is natural, is that they kind of shed their skin, and they ended up repositioning themselves as space-age meanies, and that original allegory sort of, I'm not going to say it got lost entirely, but it did diminish the more the Daleks returned to the show. And that isn't to denigrate them per se, because there's still a lot of mileage in them if they're used correctly, and whether or not they have been used correctly is a matter of debate. But the point is, I still think that the Daleks, even if the sheen of that original parallel was worn away the more they came back, they still had an impact. The Daleks work on a lot of different levels, even just superficially. But in creating Davros, Nation throws the focus back on them quite a lot, actually. And I know that they sort of like end up being in the background of this story because Davros takes the focus. But by creating Davros, the Daleks do have focus put on them, because what are they in relation to their creator? Now, it's not as if Davros is, because of the way the Daleks are made up, it's not like Davros is their god, So by creating Davros, you got the Daleks that were the Nazis, and with Davros, Nation seems to draw inspiration from Hitler. No wonder then that he's such a good villain. Blinkered, reactionary, bigoted, obsessed with purity and the survival of his race at the cost of all others. Davros is an excellent character. His self-serving treachery and lies to conceal that make him one of the best villains we've had. Okay, maybe even the best villain we've had. Superbly written and performed with choices which border on genius by Michael Wisher. He is instantly striking, but he hardly moves. The first glimpse of him is just wonderful, and the design of him is so well thought out. Now, obviously, recently, in the last 12 months, Davros has undergone a sort of like reimagining. In the Destination Skaro minisode, Julian Bleach played Davros without the disfigurement and the chair. Russell T Davies has said that's because of the trope of disabilities being used unfairly when depicting villainy, and that's a point I kind of agree with. As a James Bond fan, the idea that that disability equals villainy is a trope that needs addressing. I personally, I think, would have addressed it a different way, and that would have been to maybe just not use Davros. I think the thing about Davros is that it isn't that it's suggesting that disability equals villainy. This is all drawn in with this parallel that I detect with Hitler, and I think the point that Nation is using is that obviously we look back in hindsight. Hitler's the greatest villain of the 20th century. A photograph of him without that context, he just looks like an ordinary bloke, and because we can't really remove Hitler from what he did, we can't see him before, with eyes from before he did what he did. And the idea, I think, that Nation is saying is that do not underestimate true evil. Davros is evil. He happens to be disabled, and that's why he may be underestimated. And while I do think Russell T Davies has got a point about the trope of disability when it comes to depicting villainy, it's such a big part of Davros's character that, like I say, if Russell felt like that, the best thing to do would be to just not use Davros, rather than throwing this whole, oh, is it a pre-accident Davros or what? Because I was under the impression that Davros created the Daleks after the accident, so Destination Scarra throws that theory out the window. And like I say, I think the design of him is incredibly well thought out. After he was introduced to the show, further encounters with the Daleks saw him return. Like in the classic series, every single subsequent Dalek story, Davros is there. And there is the argument that came to diminish the Daleks, and I can see that because, well, I don't see it as a surprise because he overshadows the Daleks here, and he does that for a reason. Returning to what inspired the Daleks to find still fertile ground to create another monster, which in turn returns the Daleks to what made them so effective, is a masterstroke, and positively refreshing from the man who has coasted with his last two offerings. Here, he doesn't show us what he's capable of, as much as remind us what he's capable of. Even the machinations among the Carlets to stop Davros's plans echo the von Stauffenberg assassination attempt on Hitler. And here, the Nazi parallels seem more overt with the Carlets than with the Daleks, for obvious reasons. But this still serves to remind us of where the Daleks had their inspiration, considering the Carlets are destined to become Daleks. By expanding on that initial parallel, Nation strikes gold once again, and within the grittier confines of this show's new lens, it only heightens the piece. So obviously you've got that imagery of the Daleks against the trenches, which is far from subtle, but no less impactful. For the first time in a Dalek story, possibly ever in a Dalek story, there's actual palpable dread. Real tension and genuine chills as it unfolds, and given how I've been viewing the show as kind of a bit like plodding along since The Time Warrior, these 6 episodes arrive like an explosion. Call me boring, call me predictable, but I really do believe that Genesis of the Daleks is the best story yet. And the fact that it's the 78th one and it comes at the end of the 12th season, that is just wonderful. Like, it reminds me that I haven't quite got the measure of the show yet, even if I might think I have. It reminds me that the show is still capable of new and exciting things. Now, not that this story is new to me at all, not even that the show is new to me. If you've just joined the marathon at this video, this isn't my first time watching Doctor Who. It's not even my first time watching Doctor Who in order from the very beginning. I think this marathon's my 4th lap, and I've watched all of the stories in isolation as well. So, having been a fan for 35 years, Genesis of the Daleks, I've seen many times before. And I first saw this one in the early 90s. It was my first exposure, I think, to Tom Baker as the Doctor, and it was utterly mesmerising. And I'm led to believe just how good it actually is by the fact that the countless times I've watched it in the 32 years since, it never actually diminishes for me. Since I made the decision years ago to only ever watch Doctor Who in order from the very beginning, it means that years elapse between viewings. And I was saying to a friend recently, Tom, you right? That occasionally, yes, I'll want to watch a Doctor Who story. I'll feel like reaching for a Doctor Who story, but its turn isn't coming yet on the marathon, so it becomes like a delayed gratification sort of thing. And Genesis of the Daleks is one of those sort of like handholds along the way that I can see looming in the distance as it approaches, and I can't wait to get to it. And then when I do get to it, it never lets me down. So even though years elapse between watching it, I have never been disappointed by Genesis of the Daleks, despite the fact that the hype for it is incredibly high each and every time. And in fact, if the hype only gets higher, but it never actually fails to live up to that, I do sort of think that it's not just that it's not diminishing since I first watched it in 1992. It actually improves. This isn't just great Doctor Who. This is great TV on its own terms. And I love Doctor Who so much that occasionally some below average stories might get an easy ride by dint of being part of my favourite show. But honestly, with Genesis of the Daleks, I do think that it just earns its stripes. I don't think it's a case of like, oh, I'm giving Genesis of the Daleks an easy ride. And I know full well that there are people that look at Genesis of the Daleks' reputation and feel like it's a bit overrated. And you know what? I can't see that myself. It's a viewpoint I can't share. It's one I respect, because if a story gets that hyped up, I do understand that sometimes it may not live up to those expectations. I've got similar stories as well. But with Genesis of the Daleks, I'm viewing this whole marathon like as an exercise, sort of like pretty as objectively as I can. Obviously, I love Doctor Who, but I do look at Genesis of the Daleks, and I try to spot maybe where it might fall down. And there's only one area which, spoiler alert, it'll be the low light at the end of this video. I'm not going to tell you what it is right now, but otherwise I just think it's perfect. It's atmospheric from the beginning, and this, I believe, is the story where Tom well and truly comes into his own as the Doctor. He makes no grand entrance, he shuffles on, puffing his cheeks and waving his arms. He's confident in the role, talking with the Time Lord, and consequently inheriting further backstory from before his time. He takes this backstory, and for what feels like the first time, disregards it almost by moving forward with it in his own way. These 6 episodes give Tom more opportunities to prove himself than any of his previous stories combined, and he appears grateful for them all, throwing himself into this one with seemingly more enthusiasm than he has since taking on the part. Yeah, okay, he japes around enough to remind us he's good at that, but his solemnity, when the Doctor thinks Sarah and Harry are dead, shows precisely that he is capable of every facet of the Doctor. With the arc in space, I did make mention of how I didn't feel like the new era had actually properly started. It felt like it was sort of like combining echoes of the show's past. Now, a large part of that was down to Tom Baker, who almost like an uncertainty in the role saw him taking baby steps, which was absolutely fascinating to watch. But here it feels new, and a large part of that is his sort of like energized attack on the material. This now definitely feels like a new era. This would be true even without what I consider to be this story's greatest moment for the Doctor. His "Have I That Right" speech is f***ing sublime, and Baker absolutely excels. And it's one of those speeches, because it gets to the heart of who the Doctor is, it's one of those where you can't help but wonder what it might be like delivered by other Doctors. But when those speeches come along that are so like the Doctor through and through, when it's delivered by a Doctor who has got absolutely every command of their own incarnation, while it's tempting to imagine other Doctors deliver those speeches, like, it never actually will be, I don't think, as good as the Doctor who actually ended up delivering it in the first place. And so while, you know, you can imagine Smith or Tennant or Eccleston or Troughton or Hartnell or Pertwee, or any of them, I'm not going to list them all, you know who the Doctors are, like delivering the "Have I That Right" speech, none of them would do it as well as Tom Baker does here. Having upped his game as much as he has, I am totally not ashamed to say that I get actual chills when the Doctor and Davros finally get considerable screen time together. Their dynamic is so brilliant that I think it calls to mind Pertwee and Delgado, which only cements Davros in my estimations as the villain that he is. A good villain feels like the anti-Doctor, and Davros is that villain for the 4th Doctor. Put simply, I haven't enjoyed doing this marathon as much since the Hartnell era. It isn't just down to the performances either, as outstanding as they all are. I mean, seriously, I can think of nobody who drops the ball. It's a truly impressive roster of guests. Ronson, Garman, Nyder, they're all great. They all feel real, and they all contribute in some way to the plot. They don't feel like interchangeable archetypes who've populated Nation's more recent outputs. This feels like the Terry Nation who gave us the Dalek invasion of Earth, except improved even from that. I won't lie, it's hard to reconcile this with the Nation who gave us the chase and death of the Daleks, but its excellence is what certainly stops me from having as large a pop at Nation as I may sometimes be tempted to. It's a fantastic script with phenomenally good lines throughout.
There's something different about those two. They're not Thals and they're not mutants.
We'll find out what's different about them by autopsy.
That's delicious.
Good. I enjoy interrogation.
Yes, you look the type.
Is another favourite of mine. The Doctor and Harry actually get the upper hand in this scene very quickly and capably, and that only marks them out as a really, really formidable team. And as much as I try, I couldn't imagine like the second Doctor and Jamie pulling off that scene with the aplomb that Tom and Ian Marter do. Which brings me on to the regular TARDIS crew at this moment. They've made a great team since they began, and they were already like a really formidable unit, but here it just feels like they have galvanised into being at the height of their powers. Harry's Don't You Argue Doctor with the landmine business at the very top proves his salt once again as thoroughly decent and courageous, and Sarah being separated from them and forming an escape plan of her own with the other prisoners shows her resourcefulness. So, what's the conclusion? This is a cracking TARDIS team, and finally we're seeing them at their full potential. A longer run and they could have been the one to beat, going by what we see of them here. And I know full well, I mean, they probably are a lot of people's favourite TARDIS team. I myself have got ones that I, prefer ever so slightly. But if Harry, Sarah and the Fourth Doctor had spent longer together than they actually do, then that would have, given them far more opportunities to rise above. And because they are so good, they probably would have. That's what I'm saying. I think if they'd had a longer run together, they would be my favourite TARDIS team. I mean, Sladen has been delightful since she jumped aboard, and she's formed very real relationships with two different Doctors as if they are the same man. Now, that does feel like it should go without saying, but it's worth pointing out that at this point in the show, the only other hangover companions from one Doctor to the other were Ben and Polly. Now, as great as Michael Craze and Annika Wills are at playing Ben and Polly, they do act slightly differently with Troughton than they do with Hartnell. Now, again, that sounds like it might be obvious because Hartnell's a very different actor from Troughton, and so the energy in the relationship will change. And it is, I mean, Sladen does the same thing. She performs with John Pertwee and Tom Baker, who are very different actors from each other, and so the energy is different. But what Elizabeth Sladen does that I don't think Michael Craze and Annika Wills did as well is that she doesn't modify her performance so much that it feels like she's playing against two different actors. Elizabeth Sladen keeps Sarah static enough that she doesn't treat them any differently. So she becomes quite the anchor when it comes to this particular regeneration. From the Third Doctor to the Fourth Doctor, I think it works as well as it does. Not necessarily because of the efforts of Tom Baker, because I think he should take a lot of the credit, obviously, but mainly the credit lies with Elizabeth Sladen. And the fact that she does that so quietly, I'm not going to say she's an underrated companion. She's obviously the best remembered companion from the classic era. She's the first one to have come back in the revived show. Like, Elizabeth Sladen as Sarah Jane Smith does get her props. So it's not that I think she's underrated, but that particular element of her performance does continue to go unsung. Equally, Ian Marter as Harry has slotted in beautifully. His old-fashioned aura harking back, as I mentioned previously, to the sort of companion that Ian was back at the very beginning. And more than that, not only does he gel very well with the Doctor and Sarah, Harry's a great character in his own right. I'm forever drawn to Marta's reaction as Harry when the Doctor emerges attacked by the creature at the close of episode 5. Marta is absolutely outstanding. It's the tiniest move forward, but it's all in his face. Having never read any of his novelisations, I can't really give my opinion on Ian Marter's writing, but boy, could the man act. So, with some very real dynamism to the direction and a realisation on the part of the show and its personnel as to what it could actually accomplish, via the light bulb moment the writer must have had when suggested to try something different, going back to the creation of the Daleks seems like exactly the right thing to do with them. They've been re-energised, the show has been re-energised, the new Doctor is energised. we are firing on all cylinders. Now, part of that might be because while this story wasn't the last story of the season as broadcast, I do believe that it was the last of the 5 of these stories filmed. And so maybe that is a result of this feeling like a culmination. Whatever the reasons, this does now feel like we're cooking. After 397 episodes, the show, as it approaches its 13th season with, I don't know, like, I've lost track of how many viewings of this story after having seen it for the first time 32 years ago. Genesis of the Daleks is still capable of surprising.
Yes, I would do it. That power would set me up above the gods. And through the Daleks, I shall have that power!
Attack of the Clams. Seriously, that is the only thing I can think of wrong with it. And even then, it's still a good scene. Like this, that's almost by default. It's just that the prop is slightly the most unfortunate part of it. I did wonder about whether or not to cite this idea that what the studio-bound production of Doctor Who sometimes failed to do was convey distance. So because there was a lot of standing sets, there's always like back to here, back to there, back to here, without the journey in between. So the Khaled Dome and the Thal City have to be further away than they feel. But that's unfair on Genesis of the Daleks to cite that as the low light, I think, when it's just a part of the TV practice at the time and isn't really too big an issue. As ever, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this delve into the Daleks past, then you know how YouTube works. Please do hit the like thumb and share it around. It would be great to get as many Doctor Who fans along for the marathon as possible. And what do you think of Genesis of the Daleks? Is its status as one of the best ever stories of all time valid? Or do you think it has a tendency to be vastly overrated? Do you think that Davros is a legitimate inclusion into the pantheon of great Doctor Who villains? Or does he leave you a little bit cold? And do you think his appearance here is a huge part of why the character works? Or does it not matter what he looks like? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon for the final story of Season 12, which is another big return for Doctor Who's other big monster. So, if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, clang the cloister bell, and I'll meet you back on the Nerva Beacon.